This looks like a dream set up on paper. A broke nursing student catches the attention of a rich, powerful man, and suddenly her whole life changes. But the brutal genius of this story is that it refuses to stay a fantasy. Because Dominic is not some polished billionaire fantasy, and he's a mafia king carrying an empire of ghosts on his back, and Clara is not just the girl he falls for. She becomes the one soft place in a man built entirely out of armor. That's what makes it hurt. The more he loves her, the more dangerous her existence becomes. The more she sees the good in him, the more the audience realizes how much darkness is still circling them. And the cruelest part? She may be the only person who can save what is left of his soul, but loving him might cost her everything. That's the hook. Not just will they be together, but how much blood, fear, and sacrifice will it take before they earn a future that even resembles peace?
Clara Bennett was a portrait of social inertia, a single point of utter calm amidst the vibrant chaos of a Manhattan high-rise. For 3/4 of an hour, she hadn't moved, her hand clutching a glass like a lifeline as she watched the room's poised hunters and felt herself vanish. A cryptic, unsigned invitation 3 weeks earlier had set this trial into motion. A gilded lure dropped into the waters of her world. A nursing student who knew only austerity, she was an outlier among these giants. A contrast so stark it felt like a deliberate act of cruelty. Her dress, a thrift shop piece she had painstakingly altered, now felt like a confession. Each stitch seemed to announce her outsider status, fueling the inner voice that whispered she was a simple sparrow, lost among stunning, exotic birds of paradise. An unapologetic bump from a guest passing by was the final emotional fracture. It confirmed her invisibility and sparked a primal urge to escape, a self-preservation instinct to get out before her spirit was shattered beyond repair. This must be a mistake, she told herself. Some kind of mix-up. Any story to soothe the burn of her humiliation. As she turned to leave, she was completely oblivious to the watcher above, a silent predator observing the first move in his carefully arranged game. Dominic Caruso watched her from a balcony. He wasn't drawn by her looks, but by her sheer, unvarnished realness. In a room filled with calculated performances, her authentic discomfort was a lighthouse, marking her as a compelling anomaly. For a solid hour, he had absorbed every tiny signal of her distress, her profound sense of isolation. He interpreted her determined retreat not as defeat but as a tactical withdrawal, and his decision to intercept her shattered his own code of deliberate inaction. In a heartbeat, all his cold, calculated plans were abandoned. He moved to cut off her retreat, his voice a low rumble as she neared the exit. "Leaving already?" To her, he appeared like a vast shadow, an imposing figure blocking the light. His stare was a physical weight, rooting her to the floor. The voice she eventually mustered was surprisingly steady. "I could tell," he said, his words a brilliant move that validated her anxiety while affirming his own unsettling complete awareness. The party's noise dissolved into a low hum as her own pulse thundered in her ears. Her admission of feeling out of her element was met with a statement that stole her breath. "And yet, you are here, in my house." Her entire world tilted on its axis. When he gave his name as Dominic Caruso, a name she knew meant immense influence and terror, a profound chill settled deep within her. The man from the society pages, the one who orchestrated this entire night, stood before her now. This man was nothing like the distant corporate figure she'd imagined. He enclosed her hand with his, holding it too long, dissolving her boundaries. His next words were a razor, slicing away her anonymity. "I know exactly who you are." He presented the entire affair as a form of repayment, a debt of thanks, a perfect and disarming piece of manipulation. His observation was reframed as care, shifting him from hunter to guardian with a single phrase. "You're the one who saved my mother's life." Her memory offered nothing. The incident was a complete void. He filled in blanks, Bellevue Hospital, the surrounding pandemonium, her own calm, showing a terrifying familiarity with her past and seizing authority over her own story. "Mrs. Romano," she finally whispered, the name surfacing from a deep fog. Her angel in blue scrubs, Frau, he confirmed, the phrase heavy with an almost devotional reverence. It was the first glistening thread in a web of fantasy he was spinning around her. I was only doing my job, she protested, trying to pull the moment back to mundane reality. He dismissed her version with a grand, sweeping gesture, supplanting it with his own high-stakes drama and changing the very substance of her memory. He presented the lavish party as a tribute, then immediately rejected it with performative disgust, a ploy to make her an instant ally in her own alienation. This textbook tactic forged a shared enemy, pulling her closer while severing her from everyone else. He spoke of the others with contempt, calling them vacant and insincere in a show designed to elevate her through comparison. She felt a surprising rush of warmth, not offense, as the initial, fragile tendril of a devastating bond took hold. "Don't go!" he pleaded, his tone carrying an astonishing vulnerability, a masterful illusion for a man of his power. He said he just wanted to understand her, tapping into a deep-seated need for validation she never knew she had. And so, she stayed. She had no idea she was speaking with a kingpin of the city's criminal empire. Her choice to stay wasn't a choice at all. It was the soft click of a lock on a gilded cage, a step into a reality designed to take her apart and put her back together. 1 hour, she negotiated, a last futile effort to hold on to a sliver of her own agency. The triumphant gleam in his eyes showed he had already claimed victory. He led her away, physically plucking her from the known world and into his own shadowed domain. His private office was a carefully crafted illusion of warmth and normalcy, a stark difference from the party's sterile opulence. Family pictures were strategically positioned to build the image of a regular man, engineered to lower her guard. He pointed to a photograph of his niece, Isabella, using the child's image to present his motives as morally sincere. It was a calculated effort to gain her trust, reshaping his fixation into something noble while hiding the deeper disturbance driving it. His refusal of a drink spoke of a man who needed absolute self-mastery. When he gave her a glass of water, his knuckles brushed against hers, a brief spark of contact meant to evade her rational mind and appeal straight to her feelings. He asked about her life, and she gave it to him, piece by painful piece. The story of her orphaned youth and constant hardship poured out of her, unknowingly handing him the very map to her soul's weakest points. As she revealed her story, his focus was total, his gaze unwavering. It was not a look of compassion, but the keen, appraising stare of a predator taking inventory of her scars, noting the exact fissures he could later use against her. He called her trauma, true suffering, and her survival, grace. He spun her entire history into something beautiful and heroic, a potent validation that made him seem like the only one who could ever truly see her essence. In that moment, she felt a profound bond, a sensation of being truly seen. When she asked about his own pain, he deflected with a cryptic smile. "That's a very long story," he murmured, adding to his mystique and tightening his grip. His own tale was a work of self-serving theater, painting his brutal life as a destiny he never chose. He made himself both the tragic figure and the champion of his own saga, a story built to win both her pity and her awe. "You're lonely," she said, the observation slipping out before she could stop it. His feigned surprise at her insight pulled her deeper, making her feel uniquely perceptive as the minutes turned to hours under the spell of his undivided attention. A ringing telephone broke the trance. Her move to leave was met with his expertly performed reluctance. His offer of a car service was no mere courtesy. It was a final show of power, a leash to ensure his presence followed her home. After a silent internal war, Luca gave a slight nod. A life defined by want compelled her to reach for this perilous, magnetic man. Vittorio led her away, his hand hovering at her lower back, a phantom touch that implied ownership. His voice was a soft command veiled as a confession. "I need to see you again, Luca Bennett." He painted himself as a victim of his own status, a classic ploy to create a rapid, unearned intimacy. Luca's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Every fiber of her being screamed a warning that fought against the intoxicating pull of his words. But a part of her romanticized the fall, believing this danger was the only escape from her gray existence. She offered her address and her work schedule, effectively giving him the layout of her cage. Vittorio's answering smile was that of a predator cornering its prey. "I'll see you Tuesday, Luca," he stated, every word sealing his claim on her future. She would later remember his unreadable look as she was led from the room, her journey home a confusing blur, a storm of thoughts that left her gasping for air. In her own mind, the night was no longer just a meeting, but a rescue. She'd been chosen from obscurity by a powerful man. This twisted thinking, this delicate idea she labeled a chance, became the first thread in the unbreakable web of a trauma bond. She saw it not as threat, but as destiny, a dangerous story the brain invents to rationalize a destructive connection. If the anatomy of Luca's later ruin is of interest, the coming scenes will expose it. Her memory of that following Tuesday is tinted with the rosy glow of romance, a recollection remade by longing. For the next few days, Luca was lost in a feverish daydream of obsession, replaying their meeting until it felt like a scene from a movie. She insisted to herself that Vittorio wouldn't actually come, a feeble mental defense against the sharp sting of his possible rejection. She tried to shield herself with the cold logic of status and money, a desperate bid to rebuild the world she understood. She then retreated into the anesthetic routine of her work, its cadence a balm for the chaos inside her, her colleagues a hollow echo of a family. As the hours wore on, hope gave way to a quiet defeat. The clock read 3:15, and then Vittorio appeared, less a person than a force of nature that shattered the stillness. He owned the doorway, a figure so commanding that time itself seemed to pause, radiating a power that was absolute and cold. Vittorio played his role with a terrifying focus. The room full of people faded away as his world shrank to include only Luca, creating an island of intimacy in the crowd. His calm words sealed their bargain, and the sound of her own reality became a distant, meaningless hum. A heavy silence, saturated with his power, fell upon them. To her stunned disbelief, he made a promise that felt like forged metal. "I always deliver on my word." The stares of the room didn't touch him. He was the definition of control. Luca could only fall back on her professionalism, her last defense against the storm. Beneath her practiced stillness, the tremor in her hands was a confession of her fear. "You seem to hold more authority here," Vittorio noted, his voice a blade wrapped in silk, positioning himself as her only ally and weaving a stronger, invisible bond. His voice was a soothing pressure that broke her control completely. The ghosts of her past, of pain and struggle, tumbled out of Luca. He caught her vulnerability, claiming her wounds as his own before his laugh, a startling human sound, cracked the monstrous image she had built of him. A partition formed in her mind, splitting the man she was seeing from the monster she had feared. Over the next hour, Vittorio carefully excavated her soul, learning her dreams, her fears, and her loyalties, all under the guise of simple conversation. As she spoke of the simple comforts that defined her world, he leaned closer, his intense focus a perfect imitation of utter fascination. He offered his own history as a curated narrative of gifted intellect and reluctant duty, a story built to win her sympathy. He mentioned his mother's cooking, a detail engineered to create a sudden, unearned feeling of closeness. Time seemed to warp, stretching minutes into the illusion of a shared history. Then came his quiet instruction. "You will join me for dinner." She saw the cliff edge and knew the fall would be fatal, but emotionally she was already over the side. Logic had only ever brought her loneliness. He then echoed her own belief in being genuine, cementing a flawless and entirely fabricated connection. While they traveled through the city, he slowly erased the space between them. A quiet invasion of her personal world. Her focus narrowed to only him, and the bodyguards following them became indistinct shadows. The family restaurant was a stage meticulously chosen to radiate false safety. The restaurant's warmth felt like a beautifully crafted deception. The owner's greeting laid the performance bare. The woman's use of his family name held no affection, only the cold acknowledgement of a power that needed no introduction. Vittorio orchestrated the interaction like a master strategist, mentioning his father and praising the food in a perfect display of social dominance. He led her to an isolated table, his private theater for the main act. At that moment, Luca didn't see a man. She saw a king. Separate facts began to click into place within her mind, drawing a dark picture that pointed to one terrible truth. Vittorio began to confess, cloaking his words in sorrow, speaking of actions I'm not proud of, to cast himself as a tragic hero. He was not, he admitted, the man he seemed to be. When she asked, he wove a tale of legacy, of a dynasty built by methods that the law does not approve of. He framed his life as a destiny he could not escape, washing his hands of any personal choice. A deep and chilling fear took hold of her, but her eyes never left his. He described the truth of his life with the clean, impersonal language of business. He offered her an excuse, a fragment of respectability she could hold, a reason to stay. When she finally uttered the words, "Crime lord," he offered a soft correction. He was the head of his family. The shift in language separated the man from his violent acts. Her urge to run became a fading signal, crushed by the immense weight of his presence. His raw admission should have been a screaming siren, but to her, it sounded like a profound gesture of trust. Vittorio then spoke of his mother, wrapping his coercion in a soft blanket of sentiment that left her utterly blind. He presented a cruel, false choice: leave with the truth or stay. The proposal was not an offer, but a quiet test of her very soul. As the waiter drew near, her fingers found a piece of bread, a desperate anchor in a storm of psychological warfare. Her mind latched onto the single noble reason he offered: a lone star in a suffocating black sky. Building on this, Vittorio spun a tale of protecting a young cousin, cloaking his darkness in the righteous armor of family. He grazed the edges of her fear, hinting at the violence he held in reserve. She, in turn, softened his monstrous form, using the lens of her own trauma to see him in shades of gray. "Nobody is just one thing," she whispered, an absolution he watched her grant with cold, calculating eyes. Vittorio praised her for her stillness in the face of his world, naming her an exception, someone of value. In that moment, she surrendered her right to judge him, her own brokenness becoming the key that unlocked his door. The air grew lighter, yet a new, more profound darkness settled between them. He then unspooled his life story, a version edited for her ears. The evil father, the sainted mother, and the fragile niece, a detail engineered to awaken her need to protect. This, with tales of his own iron will, painted a man too tragic to be purely a monster. Then it was Clara Ara's turn to bleed. She confessed the guilt that stalked her nights, the nightmares of her parents' passing, admitting that her work was the one fragile scaffold holding her together. Beyond the glass, the city was a void, its voice finally silent. Dominic's car slid up beside them, but he waved it on. He wanted to walk. And there, on the neutral territory of a Brooklyn sidewalk, his hand closed over hers. Clara Ara felt the warmth, felt her own traitorous body refuse to pull away. "This is a bad idea," she breathed, her voice devoured by the night. He let her words land, performing a flawless imitation of a vulnerability he could never truly feel. And still, it was she who leaned into the moment. In answer, Dominic stopped, turning to face her completely. He spoke of a fear he swore he'd never known, a fear he claimed she alone had planted within him. He accepted her comforting touch, a rare and perfectly timed concession. When she asked about their future, he asked only for her trust, not in his power, but in him. He was begging her to believe in the beautiful fiction he had crafted just for her. Clara Ara could feel every warning, every invisible tripwire strung in the air between them. But the sheer force of his presence, the unspoken promise in his gaze, overruled all logic. Her heart was making a vow her mind could not break, tying the first knot of a beautiful ruin. The following weeks were a gorgeous, relentless siege of his attention. Dominic was a constant, appearing with gifts she never asked for, his name an eternal light on her phone. He was forging a new reality around her, a system designed for her complete emotional surrender. He brought her to his mother, Mrs. Caruso, whose gushing, instant embrace felt like a final, binding approval. Step by step, Clara Ara was absorbed into their ways, the borders of her own life dissolving as she was woven into the fabric of their dynasty. She was introduced to Isabella, a 7-year-old girl who unintentionally became a bridge of trust. The girl's easy affection slowly broke down Clara's defenses, creating an image of safety and innocence within the family's guarded world. To see Dominic with his niece was to witness a sea change in Clara's soul. The cold-blooded enforcer she knew simply faded, replaced by the warmth of a gentle protector. In this perfect mirage, she found permission to wall off the monster and cling to the guardian. Then, in a quiet moment, the thought bloomed like a poison flower. His brutal enterprise was not a stain on his character, but the very proof of his ferocious devotion. His world of violence began to warp in her mind, becoming something akin to divine. His loyalty was no longer a chain, but a medal he had won. Each savage act was recast as a sacrament in a creed above ordinary laws. This fragile fantasy was the only thing holding her together. The truth haunted their home, a specter in the hushed midnight phone calls and the fresh, unspoken wounds on his men. Dominic painstakingly sculpted her perception, building a sanctuary around her to shield her from the grim nature of his life, preserving the flawless man she held in her heart. Then, one night, the illusion they had built fractured. The warmth drained from Dominic, leaving a man of pure ice. He tried to retreat, but Clara pushed deeper, believing her love was a key to his darkness, the very heart of their toxic bond. When she heard Marco was hurt, she offered no judgment, only the solace of her presence. With that simple act, she became his sanctuary, a place where the darkness that clung to him could be absolved without a word. He promised Marco would recover, painting the violence as a rival's message and himself as the sole avenger. A chilling fear settled in her heart, but she stayed. The ties that bound them in crisis only grew stronger. "What will you do?" she whispered. His answer was a vow forged in shadows, to defend his family whatever the cost. She decided then not to ask again, a willful ignorance. Having entered his world, she now sought her role within its rot. The edges of her universe began to shrink. He brought her to his home, calling it a fortress for her safety. But a fortress is also a cage, and with each passing day, her life contracted, leaving her dependent on the man who was both her protector and her captor. In the twilight of his world, she witnessed his private agony. The sleepless nights, the haunted stare, the tremors of a soul in torment. A sane mind sees a warning. She saw a wound only her love could heal, drawing her deeper into his storm. She discovered him one evening surrounded by photographs in the library's gloom. It was a perfectly staged moment of weakness, a deliberate glimpse into his shattered past designed to chain her to him with a myth of fated connection. He called the people in the photos ghosts, his father, his sister. The girl, Valentina, was the heart of this family, he said. When Clara asked what happened to her, his silence fell like a shroud, heavier than any story could be. He spun a tale of a sister stolen by a predator, a failure of protection he swore would never happen again. And just like that, every controlling glance, every possessive act, was recast as a scar from old pain, not the bars of a new cage. She embraced his narrative, desperate to soothe his fear of losing her too. He gave her a cruel ultimatum: leave and be safe or stay. His question, why, was a blade, demanding she give voice to their shared sickness. She cast aside the very idea of safety, pledging to welcome all of him, even the darkness that coiled in his soul. In the quiet that followed, their embrace sealed this silent vow. She had knowingly entered the epicenter of his beautiful, tragic, and damned world. In the weeks that followed, she drowned in his life. He purchased her future with the price of her education. His kin now stood where her own family once was. Violence became a background hum, and she felt the needle of her soul's compass begin to waver. The arrival of a new rival, Victor Castellaniano, only made their world smaller. Conversations would die when she entered a room, casting her as a sacred thing to be protected, kept apart from the coming war. The illusion of safety shattered the day she saw the car. A stranger, his gaze fixed on her like a predator. The abstract threat of Dominic's life suddenly had a face, and it was watching her. His name was the only sound she could make. His men appeared from the shadows to flank her. When she finally saw him, his fury was a cold, controlled thing, his only question a frantic loop. Did he approach you? Did he speak to you? He twisted his guilt into a weapon, blaming himself for putting her in harm's way. As she tried to comfort him, he called her his bullseye, a beautiful vulnerability. With those words, her reliance on his protection became absolute. When she asked about his plan, her voice was that of an ally, not a victim. He spoke of neutralizing the threat, framing his coming violence as a chapter in an epic of family honor. Fear resonated inside her, but her soul had accepted his savage code. In the quiet hours before dawn, she made a final promise to herself. There was no going back. She would stand with him, whatever fire came. Her own instinct for survival was now an antique, sacrificed to their shared trauma. Outsiders saw their shared madness and called it devotion, a boundless love. 3 days later, the war with Victor Castellaniano ignited, and the thing they called love became an inferno. Clara would forever cling to the memory of that last peaceful morning, the quality of the light, the aroma of coffee, a distant child's laugh. She held this fragile moment like a shield against the storm she had told herself was over. The ring of his phone split the air. She watched the color drain from his face as his body went rigid with a silent, consuming rage. His voice, when it came, was flat and final. Castellaniano has made his move. 12 of his men were gone. 3 warehouses were now smoldering ruins. But the true strike was a set of photos of her, sent to prove he knew Dominic's single weakness. Staring at her own face, now a target, Clara's world simply fractured. Dominic looked at the images and saw not a weakness, but a reason to become a god of retribution. "You do not threaten my family," he vowed, his voice a low promise of utter destruction. After that, their world shrank to the size of a gilded cage. Clara accepted the confinement of their home, a willing prisoner as her spirit slowly eroded. Watching Dominic hollowed out by his war, she became his compass, his anchor in a world dissolving into violence. His mother's prayers became a constant, desperate hum through the house, while Clara fought to build a wall of normalcy around the child Isabella. She forced Dominic to eat, to sleep. On the fourth night, he returned bearing the marks of a savage fight. The sight of him, shirt in tatters, knuckles bleeding, a fresh gash across his face, woke the clinician in her. Her voice turned to iron as she commanded him, "Sit," and tended to his wounds. He obeyed like a soldier, broken. After she was done, he reached for her, his voice cracking as he confessed his own weakness. He laid out a new life for her, an escape, a world without him, preparing her for his end. She met his plan with a fierce, absolute rejection. She would not allow that future. He collapsed into her defiance, clinging to her like a lost boy. They found shelter in the past, in the chaos of the night they met, the night she had always called crashing his party. She demanded he promise they would both see the other side of this. His vow wasn't enough. It bled into a desperate proposal, a vision of a wedding they might never have, described with the clarity of a fever dream. Tears tracked through the grime on her face as she surrendered to his fantasy. He promised a real proposal, a ring, but only when the danger had passed. Their shared story was the only shield they had left against the world. All through that night, they wove a future from words, of children, and a home with a garden, a life that felt a universe away. Their mutual fiction became a fragile shelter against the encroaching dark. By dawn, their desperate dream had become their reason to survive. The final move against Castellaniano was made 2 days later. Clara wasn't there. She only heard the bloody, fractured stories afterward. Their rival, Victor, came to a peace negotiation planning to eliminate the entire Caruso family. It was a fatal miscalculation. He never grasped that Dominic's power ran so deep that his own men had already sworn allegiance elsewhere. The end was swift. Victor Castellaniano was taken not to a grave, but into federal custody, buried beneath an avalanche of evidence. The war was over. Dominic came home victorious, but his eyes were empty, haunted by the ghost of the height. For hours, he was a statue, staring into nothing. When she finally guided him home, he clung to her as if she were the only thing holding him together. He whispered that it was truly over, then confessed how broken he was inside. He swore he would become the man she deserved, a better man. Her words, her touch, became the new law he lived by. Over the next weeks, Dominic began the slow, painful work of rebuilding himself in her image. With his enemy caged, he moved with brutal speed to legitimize his world. Old deals were sealed, new alliances forged in sterile boardrooms. As the family business stepped from the shadows, his mother began channeling her fear into wedding plans. Isabella, caught up in the fairy tale, practiced her role as flower girl down imaginary aisles. Clara found a measure of calm, throwing herself into her studies and landing her dream job at a clinic in the Bronx. She wove herself into the pattern of his family, creating a life of Sunday dinners and afternoons in the park with the little girl. The quiet peace they built, moment by moment, felt real enough to be permanent. Almost 3 months after the war ended, a lightness returned to Dominic. He planned to drive out of the city into the brilliant colors of a Westchester autumn, a scene composed for a perfect memory. He pulled up to an old stone house behind a set of iron gates. When she turned to him, confused, he simply said, We're home." It was the fantasy they had whispered in the dark, now standing solid before them. He gestured to the perfect plot for his mother's garden, then to the pasture fit for Isabella's pony. Clara's entire reality seemed to buckle. He remembered every impossible piece of their shared, desperate vision. This was the home they had built from both hope and fear. He studied her, his certainty dissolving, gripped by the terror of her refusal. With the tearful whisper, she called it perfect, and that single word justified the entirety of his violent crusade. Her assent was the signal he needed. Dropping to one knee, he produced a velvet box as if from thin air. As he opened it, the diamond within captured the setting sun, scattering dazzling shards of light upon her face. His proposal was equal parts confession and plea. He professed that she had saved him, that she had unearthed the man he was always meant to become. In her, he found his salvation, a mooring for a spirit long adrift. He admitted to the shadows of his origin, allowing the beast within to show for a moment before vowing a lifetime of striving to deserve her brilliance. "Will you marry me?" he asked. Her response was to kneel, meeting him at his level. Her yes was barely a whisper. He slid the ring onto her finger, cementing their covenant. Down on their knees, they had reached the apex of their mutual fantasy, a gorgeous falsehood of a joyful ending. Their wedding that May would usher in the last, sorrowful act. Their union was consecrated at the Westchester estate. On that day, Clara let herself feel like royalty. Dominic cried freely, utterly unaware of the fractures spiderwebbing just below their flawless surface, a man certain that peace was at last his to keep. In this orchestrated scene, his mother cried softly into a handkerchief, a silent acknowledgement of their tumultuous past. Isabella, a vision of solemn youth, performed her part without a flaw. Their oaths felt less like a promise of love and more like a pact, a deliberate bargain to forge a future from the wreckage of their trauma. The officiant's pronouncement sparked the expected round of applause. Their kiss, however, was more than mere ceremony. It was a raw, desperate fusion of two powerful spirits. The subsequent reception was a calculated display of power, with wealth and intense feeling forming the dual foundations of the family's next era. Clara completed the obligatory dances with her new husband, his mother, and a joyful Isabella. Afterward, she escaped to a silent terrace, needing a moment to process the crushing gravity of her new life and the impossible path that had led her there. She knew he would find her. "Mrs. Caruso," he whispered, taking her hand. "Tell me what's on your mind. I feel like I'm dreaming, and I'm terrified of it ending." "Then we'll stay asleep forever," he vowed. After a heavy silence beneath the stars, he turned the conversation to the framework of their life ahead. "There's a great deal to arrange. I'm aiming to be completely legitimate in 1 year, not 5, he retorted. "Before we welcome our first child." Clara turned, her attention now fully seized. "Our first child? If that is a path you'd wish to walk with me." A gradual, knowing smile touched her lips. "That's a compelling proposition. We might have to move that schedule up." Dominic froze. "Clara, I was going to tell you in the morning," she admitted, "but I can't keep it in." She led his hand to her abdomen. "You're going to be a father." He remained perfectly still for a long moment. Then his control broke, and he crushed her in a powerful embrace. "Are you certain?" he questioned, his voice tight with emotion. "The doctor verified it yesterday. We're about 8 weeks." He pulled away, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "A baby, our baby, our baby." A wild, exuberant laugh burst from his chest as he twirled her around until the night sky blurred into a spiral. We need to get the finest doctors, he started, the words spilling out. The nursery, more security. And my mother has to know tonight, or she'll have my head. Dominic! The business, I'll be free of it in 6 months. Isabella will be absolutely beside herself. Her recent plea for a sibling, a product of a sudden biology lesson, was a tender issue. Dominic! His rapid-fire planning fell silent. His focus narrowed entirely to her. Breathe, she murmured, as we have plenty of time. He let out a long breath, his expression transforming into one of pure wonder. I love you, Clara, beyond measure, and I love you. We should tell your mother immediately, before she figures it out on her own. The announcement, predictably, set off a storm from the matriarch. Waves of crying, grateful prayers, and a flurry of phone calls that lit up the eastern seaboard. Isabella's response was a thunderclap, a scream of absolute joy, followed by a list of wonderfully absurd name suggestions. The months of her pregnancy unfolded in a lovely frenzied blur. Clara worked at the clinic well into her 7th month, stopping only when Dominic's hovering anxiety grew impossible to ignore. Their home in Westchester truly became a sanctuary, centered around a nursery of pale yellow populated by a legion of plush creatures. Dominic kept his promise. While Clara entered her last trimester, every remaining tie to the family's illegal dealings was methodically cut. For the first time in 100 years, the Caruso name was clean. This was a truth that felt entirely imagined when they had initially met. It seemed the very power of their bond was enough to reshape their world. Their daughter arrived on a snow-filled December morning. Dominic, a constant support beside Clara. The baby was perfect, a tiny, exquisite being with her father's dark hair and her mother's strong jawline. They called her Valentina, a conscious tribute to Dominic's late sister. Mrs. Caruso, as expected, was swept up in a tide of cleansing joy that lasted for days. The baby's birth was the last piece of their idyllic family picture. Holding her daughter, Clara appeared awestruck by the unbelievable trajectory of her life. Just 18 months prior, she was a ghost on the edge of the world. Now she was a wife, a mother, enmeshed in a family that had seized her as fiercely as she had seized it. Dominic came back from handling his mother's emotional flood. She's sleeping now, though your mother was ready for another hour with the baby. My mother would never let her go if we allowed it. He moved closer, wrapping his arms around them in a secure embrace. Thank you, he murmured. For what? For all of this, he answered quietly. This entire life I never knew was possible. Clara rested against him, sensing the constant beat of his heart. We built this, you and I, she told him softly. They stood quietly while the snow piled up outside, a deep silence falling over the house. Beyond their haven, the world kept turning in its agonizing way. But inside this delicate bubble, their little family was bathed in the glow of a flawless future. 5 years later, the house in Westchester hums with palpable life. Valentina is an unstoppable presence, a girl with her father's fire and her mother's empathy, who now commands the household. Isabella, at 12 years old, is charting the treacherous waters of adolescence, much to the family's shared delight. Mrs. Caruso resides in that guest cottage, near enough to be close, but still in her own separate space. She has grown an expansive garden that is now her colorful haven, providing her with profound tranquility. Clara opened her own clinic, choosing another underserved neighborhood instead of the Bronx, letting her act as a genuine benefactor. She gathered a dedicated team in a building that stands as a testament to her ideals, where care is an entitlement, not an indulgence. And Dominic as well was a transformed man. The legal business he founded gives work to thousands and funnels millions to charitable causes. He sits on the boards of hospitals. To the public, he is now seen as a benefactor, no longer a despot. The hushed, frightened talk that once followed him has given way to a grudging but earned respect. Yet the man beneath the surface had not disappeared. He would still burn down the world to keep her safe. The fierce devotion that initially bound them together was as strong as ever. On their 5th anniversary, Clara woke to find him observing the dawn. She slipped her hand into his. "What's on your mind?" "That evening," he answered, "at the gala, you almost got away." "I did get away, you just caught me." "And if I hadn't?" She considered that alternate reality. "I'd have gone back to my little flat, warmed up leftovers, and passed out in front of the TV. I would have lived and died, never knowing a life like this existed." Dominic faced her, the facade he wore for everyone else melting away. "I would have found you," he stated, his voice unwavering. "We were always destined to meet again. You can't know that for certain." "I do, because some people, they're fated. They are built to seek each other out, regardless of how far apart they are." A small smile played on her lips before she leaned over to kiss him. "Happy anniversary, my love." "Happy anniversary, my wife." They marked the occasion with a private dinner for their immediate family. Mrs. Caruso made her famous lasagna. Isabella gave us a scrapbook she had created, a carefully crafted chronicle of their bizarre and tangled beginnings. Valentina sang a song from school, terribly out of tune, and was met with a roaring ovation. Later, after the children were in bed, they strolled through the garden under the moonlight. The atmosphere was heavy with the fragrance of roses, as fireflies flickered like floating cinders in the night. "Do you ever miss it?" Clara's voice was a whisper. "That life, the dominion?" "Never," he replied. "The strength I have now is real. It's the peace of an uninterrupted dawn. It's meeting my children's gaze without shame. It's the certainty of a legacy built to last. The other life holds nothing to this." Her fingers intertwined with his, a silent affirmation. "I'm so incredibly proud," she murmured, "of what we became. This life we've made is beyond anything I let myself dream of." They rested beneath the familiar oak. The very place where their beginning was just a fragile, terrifying hope. "So," she nudged him playfully, "what does the next 5 years hold?" A true smile, reserved solely for her, touched his lips. "Valentina starts school, she'll probably stage a coup within the first week. Isabella gets her license and unleashes chaos on the streets. My mother will finally finish her cookbook and unleash it upon an unsuspecting world. And your clinic, it's going to need more room. And for us, we'll get older. We'll argue about nothing and agree on everything important. We'll see our children grow into themselves. There will be seasons of joy and sorrow and countless quiet days between them, days that will hold all the meaning in the world." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, not from pain, but from the staggering grace of such a simple, perfect existence. "I want that life." "Then that is the life we will have," he promised, cementing their fragile, beautiful illusion. They remained in the silence while the night breathed around them. The click of a lamp, the distant call of an owl, whispers from a wide, indifferent world that cared nothing for the story they told themselves. Clara thought of the woman she used to be, a phantom, unseen by the world, her very core carved out by loneliness. She followed the unlikely thread of decisions that led her here, reevaluating her own capacity for danger. But every path of thought led back to Dominic, the one who gave her the only thing she ever truly wanted, to exist in someone's eyes. For what, he asked, a feigned innocence forcing her to name her own erasure. For noticing me, she answered, when I was just part of the scenery. Dominic's reply was a flawless exercise in predatory grace. You were the only real thing in that room. Then he tightened his grip, reminding her of her own weakness. I could see you were trembling. A textbook move in the art of building a cage. But I also saw that you wouldn't shatter. That was the truth I saw. And here we see the predator's prime directive. Find another's strength, and then possess it. With that, he delivered the perfect killing blow. It was always you. And with those words, Clara's last walls crumbled, her own voice sealing her fate to Dominic Caruso, a textbook case of the captured swearing fealty to their creator and their beast. She gave him her entire future, a vow meant to span eternity. He echoed the impossible promise right back. The closeness that followed was not born of affection. It was the ceremonial sealing of a silent pact. When they returned to the house, her surrender was absolute. The cage had at last become her haven. Our study began with a woman who believed she was unseen, and it ends with the creation of a lethally profound bond. The woman discovered a powerful, intangible anchor for her soul, and the man, the builder of a shadow empire, learned power's greatest secret. Absolute dominion is seizing control of another's most primal fears. Do not expect a happy ending for them. Their future promises only a brutal, endless cycle of tempest and truce. Every fight, settled by a meticulously crafted calm, will only carve their shared trauma deeper, strengthening their toxic reliance. They have constructed a fortress for two, with walls built not from affection but from a perpetual self-inflicted storm. For these who have stayed with me through this dark dissection, I see you. Leave a sign in the comments below. Let me know you're still listening. If this story has left its mark on you, share it. Let others bear witness to what has unfolded here. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this tale. Thank you for your attention. And remember the lesson of this night. There are no chains more binding than those forged when a spirit starving to be seen is found by a master of the hunt.